and get underway. So our friendly Zoom announcement, we are now recording. This is the Sacred Ground Teach-In on June the 25th for Province 5 of the Episcopal Church. Amy, would you care to introduce yourself, and we'll invite each other to the circle for introductions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rick. Well, as Rick said, I first have to just say welcome. It's so good to be together today in the Sacred Ground Teach-In. My name is Amy Houghton, and I serve as the Becoming Beloved Community Coordinator for the Diocese of Southern Ohio, and an opportunity to just say a word about the role. The role is funded partly by our diocese and partly by United Think Offering and the Episcopal Church grant monies. So I am honored to be able to kind of walk hand in hand with congregations and individual leaders in our commitment to becoming beloved community. And I think that's all I'll say right now. My feet are actually on the ground in northern Kentucky, Fort Thomas, Kentucky. So I have to claim Kentucky because my heart and soul belong there, as do my roots. So if you hear some of that Southern accent come out once in a while, you'll know that's why. So with that, I will invite my brother, Larry.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Larry James. I'm on the ground here in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am a member of St. Barnabas Episcopal Church in Montgomery, a northern city in Cincinnati. And I am also one of two co-conveners for the Becoming Beloved Community leadership team for the Diocese of Southern Ohio. And I think that's it. I'll invite Margaret into the circle.
Thanks, Larry. I'm Margaret Danieri. I am the canon for mission in the Diocese of Ohio. I live in Wellington, which is just south of Oberlin, if any of that means anything to you. My role here is to talk a little bit about some thinking that I and others have been doing around sacred ground and accessibility. So I'll say more about that a little bit later. And I will invite Allison.
I am Allison Hauserman. I'm a parishioner at Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland, and I have at this point co-facilitated 3 Sacred Ground Circles, and I am the chair of the Anti-Racism Training Committee for our diocese. And I will invite Shelley.
Hi, I'm Shelley. I'm the family minister at St. Gregory's Church in Deerfield, Illinois. And we are working with another one of my colleagues at a different church this summer to create and lead a godly play-based children's curriculum about Tell Me the Truth About Racism. And I have done the Sacred Ground myself, but we want to be able to offer something for adults so they can work through their baggage, because the kids don't have the baggage as much as the adults do. So I'm here to sort of learn how to bring that together and really create a whole fall worth of anti-racism curriculum for going forward. So, and I would like to know more about Betty.
I am part of the diocesan staff for the Diocese of Ohio, and I just recently completed my first course taking Sacred Ground, and when they asked for mentors, volunteers, I said I would like to do it. So I hope to be able to offer it to my local parish in Shaker Heights in the fall and see where that takes me. So I'm really here for information. And I'll invite Libby, please, to share.
I'm Libby Crawford. My feet are on the ground in Williamsburg, Ohio, which is east of Cincinnati. I'm a postulant for deacon in the diocese, and got through my first round of class, 2 rounds of classes so far. I'm also part of Beloved Community in the diocese and one of the co-creators, midwives for worship team for our circles. Got 2 circles going right now. And I'm also working in social justice at St. Timothy's in Anderson Township, which is a very wealthy white suburb of Cincinnati. So, and I will invite Tom.
Hello, I'm Tom Austin. My greatest claim to fame is I'm a friend of Allison Hauserman. And I have not any experience with Sacred Grounds, so I'm looking forward to this presentation today.
Tom, you want to invite somebody else? Can you see the screen?
I'm not sure who else is involved that has not been invited.
Len
So
or
I don't
Kathy?
have that. What's that?
Okay, then I will invite Len to speak. And
Thank
then
you.
Kathy.
Well, unlike Tom, I hate technology, so I don't start pushing buttons because I lose things. I'm Len Roberts. I'm the senior warden at Christ Church, Dayton, Ohio, and we're looking at running a Sacred Ground sessions starting September 14th, going 5 sessions before Thanksgiving, taking Thanksgiving break, and then coming back in January and doing the last 5 sessions. I
Okay,
can't see anybody else on the screen, so Margaret, go ahead.
all right, then I'll invite Kathy.
Okay. So hi, I'm Kathy Van Bogard. I am a member of Trinity Church in Gladstone, part of the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan. And I'm also part of the Great Lakes Peace Center, which has been in partnership with the diocese for the last 4 or 5 years now, I think. So in my dual role with that, I have been a member of the Justice and Peace Committee, and that has also evolved into a Becoming Beloved community team. And so we definitely have a focus on social justice issues. With the Peace Center, I think we've been focused for a while on building bridges with our Indigenous neighbors, and also some earth care projects and activities, and also working with the Sacred Ground curriculum, and we'll be sharing some of that with you today as far as kind of the process our team has taken and how we hope to offer that in the Diocese of Northern Michigan.
Thanks, Kathy. Well, it's great to meet you all. And just for a little housekeeping, so you know what's going on, you will receive a harvest from today's activities, from our work together. You'll also become part of this network now. Whether or not you like it, you're in, and we're going to keep track of you. We're going to put you on our mailing list, and it's all good stuff. We are meeting throughout the province and really wanting to engage others in this work. This is difficult work, but important work, and we fully believe in it and have thrown ourselves completely into it. So I would like to let you know that we're going to have some prayer, and we'll have our panel discussion. We'll talk about resources. We'll have Q&A throughout. You're always welcome to put things in the chat if you like. If that's a little overwhelming for you, you can just wait and we'll announce it's time for question and answer. So we'll move on with an opening prayer, and I think Amy's going to do that for us.
Yes, thanks, Rick. We're offering up as our prayer a poem that we often go back to, this group of us that have been meeting for some time in our commitment to becoming beloved community. And the title of the poem is called Prophets of a Future Not Our Own. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is our work. Nothing we do is complete, which is a way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the mission of liberation. No set of goals and objectives includes everything. This is what we are about. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and to do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Amy. As for our land acknowledgement this afternoon, we recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of this land and honor the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We pay respect to the elders past and present. For many of us, we are occupying stolen land, ancestral lands. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us together here today. Who were the Indigenous peoples who inhabited this land long before colonization? What do we know of vital tribal presence today? What is our relationship to these stories and our part in repair? So we'll start this afternoon with a panel discussion. We asked several panelists throughout the province to discuss their experience with Sacred Ground. What was their key takeaway and what was the challenge? So we're going to start by asking Larry if he would share.
Okay. Let's see. Thanks, Rick. Let me get this off my screen. Okay. Good afternoon, folks. Very, very glad to be with you this afternoon and talk about my experience with Sacred Ground. I'm probably unusual versus the other members of the panel because I actually went through Sacred Ground twice. The first time was pre-pandemic, and so we were meeting in person. And the second time was in the midst of pandemic, and we were meeting over Zoom. The first time was a collaboration of 4 different parishes within the Diocese of Southern Ohio. And the second time was a diocesan-wide offering of Sacred Ground, where we had a cross-section of people from all across the diocese in different parishes. The in-person meeting was also an opportunity to take a cut at each one of the 10 modules twice. The first time, each parish would meet amongst itself and talk about the readings and the viewings and their impressions and their thoughts. And then we would meet with the four parishes together once a quarter and summarize what we've been talking about in our individual parishes. So that's another embellishment that I found very pleasing. The offering that came from the diocese was only one shot at meeting and talking about what we've read and what we've seen. And it was as a group where we would meet, probably 30 to 40 people. And also it was by Zoom. So two different perspectives, two different methodologies for going through the process. My key takeaways were that I had a preference for the in-person meetings on sacred ground. And as long as people are comfortable, I would really recommend that you try and do that in person, because it opens up so many avenues for conversation and relationship on some very, very sensitive topics. Sometimes doing it by Zoom, it's just a little bit more detached and disengaged. And sometimes things that are said and heard take on a whole different meaning versus when you're in the same room with another person and you can read their body language and their voice inflections and all of those other things. I just think it's more authentic when you can do it in person. I also like the process that we went through, where you first went through a module with your parish, people that you know and have a relationship with, and then shared your experience with other parishes. Again, makes it easier to get through the material, makes people more comfortable in getting through the material, and it's just a more socially appetizing way to do this. I think the other aha, and this was very special for me, is understanding that Sacred Ground, covering the subject of race and racism in America, is not one-dimensional. It's not just whites and blacks. It's how race and racism has affected so many other peoples of color here in the United States. And the experiences are distinctly different as you look at African Americans, as you look at Asian Americans, as you look at Hispanic Americans, as you look at the indigenous populations in this country. Very distinctively different, but the impact and the outcome very much consistent. So it's understanding that race and racism is not about just one dynamic. There are many, many dynamics. The other takeaway is that it really allows us to dive into two different aspects of racism. One being the intentional, which was much earlier on in our history, where it was intentional. People knew what they were doing, they knew why they were doing it, and who it was affecting and how they were being affected. And then there's this thing called unconscious bias, which leads us to creating laws and policies and procedures that are systemically and institutionally impacting people based on the color of their skin in a negative way. So I think those are my takeaways. The biggest challenge right now, I think, comes from the current backlash that we're experiencing throughout our country on just the simple act of telling the truth about our history. It's being labeled as false or alternative and divisive and all those other really fun negative connotations. But what it really is still is telling the truth, and telling it with compassion, and telling it with an invitation to engage and think about how we could be better going forward. So those are my experiences, those are my takeaways, and that's the main challenge that I see going on right now in present day America. I'll put the piece back into the center for Allison.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. And Allison's picking that piece up.
Okay, as I said before, I have facilitated 3 groups and been in the planning of 4 different groups. And they've all been online, they've all been Zoom. Last year, when we all got shut down, my good friend Debbie Likens Fowler, who is also an anti-racism trainer in our diocese and part of our Becoming Beloved community group at Trinity, she and I said, well, what are we going to do? We can't go anywhere. What are we going to do? We need to keep doing the work. And so we decided we had been looking at Sacred Ground, and we decided, well, we just need to do Sacred Ground. And we contacted our clergy and said, we want to do this. And they said, fine, go for it. And we sent out emails asking people when they wanted to meet and what they wanted to do. And we initially only invited people who were on our list for Becoming Beloved community, which meant they had already expressed some interest in racial healing and justice. So we invited them. There were 75 people on that list. We got 25 people who responded that they were interested. And I think we ended up with maybe 22, something like that. And we divided them into 2 groups, one that met during the day and one that met at night. And one of them was all white and one of them was multiracial. We were 2 white trainers and we talked about that, but in the interest of getting it going, we talked to the people of color in the multiracial group, and they thought we should just go for it. So we did, even though our practice is normally to never have 2 white trainers in a multiracial group. We decided, because we're both control freaks, really, that we were going to run this in a pretty controlled way. And we didn't know how it was going to work on Zoom. Neither of us were very familiar with Zoom. So we basically decided that the way it was going to work was we would come up with an agenda with prompts, and we would ask for volunteers to choose scripture and prayers, and we gave them the Sacred Ground resource page to do that, or they could choose something else. And each week we had these prompts and we took turns facilitating different parts. And it was 2 hours. They watched the videos ahead of time. And it pretty much took the full 2 hours for us to go around the circle on the Zoom screen. And everyone had a chance to talk to we had 2 sets of prompts. Everyone would have a chance to speak to both sets of prompts. And we did not respond to what each other had to say because our focus was really on people connecting the material to themselves and their own feelings. So we asked that you just comment on your own experience and what you learned and how it related to your background and your family. And so that's what we did and in the first group, the first 2 groups, most of the people were really, really involved and everybody seemed very happy they did it. We did lose 3 people out of those first 2 groups. And that's one of our takeaways is that it's important to make sure that facilitators understand what the program is. because the three people we lost were all college professors who all wanted to have intellectual discussions of the material and arguments about the content. And they weren't interested in the kind of sharing that we were encouraging. So, and we did use mutual invitation on Zoom. We, each person after they spoke invited someone else. And we were careful to make sure that everyone got to speak each time. And they did. And we did say you could pass, but nobody ever did. At least maybe a few times, but it was very rare. We emphasized to people the need to do the reading and watch the films and be prepared. And we spent a lot of time as facilitators preparing. And one of the things we learned was that it was important for us to support each other and check each other as facilitators, so that if one of us started to drift away from what we were trying to do, or started to comment on things people said, the other one could say, "Oh, watch what you're doing here," and we did. And at the beginning of the program, there were definitely times that I wanted to say things. I mean, we had a couple of different people who talked about how they grew up around people of many different races because their family had African-American servants. And the way they talked about it, I thought, okay, I'd love to be able to say something here, but I'm just not going to. And I think eventually people came to realize that some of what they had seen as an experience of knowing people who were different than themselves had such a huge power component to it that they didn't really, wasn't the same as having a friendship or understanding the position that the people they were talking about were in. Let's see, what else did I have down here? Oh, one of the things we learned was that when you have two facilitators, you should probably, especially online, agree ahead of time who's going to do the major communicating or who's willing to do that. I co-facilitated with someone, and both of us hated doing the communication, and we weren't very good at it. And the other group at that time had someone who sends out these lovely, gracious emails reminding people of everything and summarizing what happened at the last meeting. And so some people are good at that and some are not. So we are now at our parish making sure that we match people to co-facilitate whose gifts might be a little different. And the other thing that's a big takeaway for me is to be aware of the reactions of participants, that this is very hard stuff and it's very emotional. And it's really important as a facilitator to be aware when people are struggling and reach out to them, or at least make it known to people that you're available to talk to them, so that if someone's really struggling, they know that they can talk to you. And we did on a few occasions tell people of color in our groups that if a particular session was just too hard for them, that they should let us know and just skip it. And my co-facilitator the second time was a Black woman who a couple of times just emailed me and said, "I can't do this tonight. After what went on in the news this past week, I can't sit with a group of primarily white women and talk about race. I just can't." And I would say, well, of course not. It's fine. And I will carry that. And then, we would email other people and say, if you feel like this week's been too hard and you can't do this, it's okay. So I guess what I'm saying is being sensitive to the fact that this is very hard emotional work, and that people need, especially our second group was I think 11 participants plus 2 trainers. But, you know, in a group that small, it gets pretty, you know, people have a chance to talk quite a bit, and they share a lot about their lives and their feelings. So it's important to keep in touch with them. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Allison. Appreciate the sharing. Amy, would you like to share now?
Sure. Let me. Yes. Okay. So it's good to hear, Larry, you and Allison both share. There's some, I'll say that because of my role, I've been able to witness, be a part of, and facilitate multiple different versions of Sacred Ground as an offering. And one of the things that is just clear is that there's so much promise in this tool and this curriculum. And, I think just to build on, I think some of what Larry and Allison shared, I'm just thinking about what's important to kind of speak to here. One, I think I'll speak a little bit to the different versions of it that I've been present to. I think in general, there's been an intention, I hope to, as Allison said, have diverse set of facilitators, co-facilitators. So even for predominantly white congregations, generally there's a hope, a desire to have both a white and a Black or a person of color facilitator. And I think that brings, some advantages and some disadvantages too. There's just a different kind of holding there. And as Allison was saying, just, having that trust and rapport between the facilitators is really important. And I say that because in one case, there was 2 facilitators that said yes, and they really didn't know each other well, a Black and a white facilitator. And I think the way that they were able to hold and facilitate it really was, it was impacted because of the lack of relationship between them. And so just being really careful about, just your ability, your capacity to hold the group in a lot of ways depends on that relationship as co-hosts, I would say, as co-facilitators. A couple of different formats I'll just kind of speak to. I think there's been, formats that where, Sacred Ground, for those of you that might not be really familiar with it, essentially it's a 10-session kind of flow or curriculum. And so there's all kinds of different ways. Lynn was saying that there's a plan with Lynn's congregation to do 5 and then take a break and then come back and do 5. I think there's one of the things I'll say is that the curriculum, the materials, the readings and the films are so dense and there's so much. So not only are there articles to read each week and films to watch, but then there's also 2 key texts that are also really valuable. And one of the things that I'll say is that oftentimes I think that those key texts aren't leaned into, aren't utilized. Often it's easy to kind of just focus on the articles, but all that to say, I think having some space between the sessions can be helpful for folks to digest, particularly for most of the sessions that I've been part of. The expectation has been that you read and you watch the films ahead of time so that the time spent together is really focused on meaning making and reflection and that kind of thing. Although there have been times where congregations say, we're going to watch the films together, and there's value there too. But to have some space between sessions feels important as a way to just kind of digest. As Allison said, this material is hard, it's disruptive. The whole idea of Sacred Ground is to unveil these lies, these myths that we've been told about who we are as a nation, as a church, as people, as communities. And so peeling away those lies, there's an impact to that, which is healing. It's what reconciliation is, but just being aware of that there's, I think, that there's that to it. It's not just like taking a class, that there really is, when you make space for it, opportunity for some significant shifts. I think one of the things that I've also been aware of is just the different intentions that have been set that then determine the design and the facilitation of sacred ground. So I think depending on what the intention is, it can really drive then the design and the way that you engage sacred ground. So for example, some congregations, it's an entryway into the work, and so a lot of the focus is on the content, and not so much of the meaning making and the sharing and the discussion and the applying it to your lives. I think that from my perspective, what that does is when the focus is on the content, it kind of keeps it an intellectual exercise. There's more kind of wanting to debate materials and that kind of thing. I think when the attention is really on, we're going to build relationship, we're going to use this as a spiritual formation opportunity, as a way to apply what we're learning back to our own lives and to our faith, then the focus is not so much on the content. It's more about, what does this mean for me? So that really depends. I think that it's important to be clear as facilitators around what is the intention here as we engage sacred ground, and let it be fluid and adapt to, because as you go through, those intentions might change, but just to be clear about that and to speak to those, with the group. I'll say that just for me, that meaning making piece is so important. That's where the promise of transformation comes in, when you can locate yourselves in the story. One of the things that's clear with sacred ground, and it does a beautiful job, I think, is it really lays bare the patterns of domination across all these groups, across time. And as Larry said, for all peoples of color and also for white folks. It's, you really do start to see the impacts of the sin of white supremacy on all of us, and how it really is at the core, at the root of our nation and our church and our lives. And I think for me, one of the things that I know, probably because of my background in trauma, is that there's a lot of grief in that. And when you can make time to feel that in your body and to bring attention to some of the body stuff, it opens up some space to be present to that. So even just we began in the few sacred ground versions that I've facilitated, doing some breathing work. We kind of brought in a little bit of the Resma Menachems in my grandmother's hands, some of the tips, some of his offerings there, in terms of just making some room for some of that grief, because truly it is like a lot of things get ripped away. And so that felt really powerful, to be able to make some space for that kind of grief work. I think I'll say something about the Zoom and in person, because that's come up. I think a lot of it is you can do this kind of work, the making space and the meaning making, on Zoom if you bring that intention to it. And so I would say that there's value always, like for me, there's value in being in person, because there's just a different energetic of being, sitting kind of side by side in a circle. And I've also found that Zoom is a place, just as we are practicing here together on Zoom, that we can be creative, we can create relationship, we can be present. It's just, you have to, that intention is really is important. So I think that's what I would say for now.
Oh,
Center.
thanks, Amy. As Amy was mentioning about frequency of meetings, Allison put in the chat that in her groups, they asked the participants how often they wanted to meet. I know Larry had mentioned in another conversation that one of his groups met monthly and the other group met every other week. So there is a lot of flexibility. At this point, if anyone has questions for any of the panelists in the chat or by voice, just relieve your mute button there and speak up. So the comment in the chat is, we are trying to create a new way to talk about in-person and online by saying on-site and online, because we are in person always. That's a really great point. Thank you, Shelley, for bringing that to our attention. Okay. Well, you can still ask questions a little later on. We're going to switch into talking about some lessons learned, tools, and resources. And for that, I'm going to call on Kathy to share the work she's been doing.
Have to unmute myself here first. Thanks, Rick. So just to give a little background on the process that we took in the Diocese of Northern Michigan, and again, you know, speaking to the flexibility that people have with how they set up their groups and their circles, we decided as a Becoming Beloved community team that we are going to take the time to go through and review all of the materials that are provided in the Sacred Ground curriculum. So we watched all the videos together, we read the articles, we looked at the books, and we started that process back in April of 2020, right when everything shut down, and decided to meet weekly until we had been able to go through and review all the materials. And then what we decided with looking at, you know, what our intention is that Amy had spoken to earlier, is that we wanted to not overwhelm people because there are so many materials and so much that you can cover. And so we decided that we would start with trying to keep the sessions to a 2-hour block of time. And then also we felt there was a real benefit to watching the videos together as a group in person, and that the rest of the time would be to help move the content from the head into the heart, as far as, you know, how did that affect you? Where are you at with this? Leaving room for that space for grief and whatever needs to happen. And then also, you know, letting people know and where to access all the other materials, so that if they wanted to do a deeper dive, they could on their own. Or we also talked about offering another session at a later time that would take more of a deeper dive into all of those materials. And so I just want to share my screen to kind of show you what we came up with. Here we go. Okay, so the other thing that we did, because we didn't have time to cover all the materials, is that we went through and decided on the ones we felt best represented the information that people would need to have to gain an overall better understanding of how systemic racism has impacted us and our country from the very beginning. And also because in our diocese, our focus has been primarily on building bridges with our Indigenous siblings. We felt there was a need to really emphasize that a little bit more. And so you'll see in session 4, we added a video that we're in the process of purchasing for the diocese that's not in the Sacred Ground curriculum, called Blood Memory, which focuses on the forced adoption issues that Native children experienced in our country. So we also felt that the movie Dawnland, which is located in session 10, really needed to be earlier in the 10-week session, because with it being more of a chronological sequence that we wanted to use. So we just felt the need to kind of switch the order around a little bit. So the other thing I forgot to mention is that our team was tasked with coming up with a guide that facilitators can use. So anyone in our diocese who would like to offer one of the Sacred Ground sessions and circles can take all of these materials and then decide, you know, how often they want to meet with their group, you know, all of the logistics with the format. So I should say that this is also still a work in progress, because we haven't officially done a sacred ground circle yet. So we're still in the early stages of doing all the planning and getting all the materials together. So this could definitely change as it actually gets put into practice, and some things may work better than others, and so we'll make adjustments and changes as needed. But for the people that are facilitating, we felt it would be helpful to just say, which session you can find each of the videos, because they aren't in the same order that you'll find on the Episcopal Church website. And then for session 10, you can see we're still kind of trying to figure out what we want to do here. And in a Sacred Ground webinar that we attended a couple months ago, Stephanie Spellers and others went through a Becoming Beloved community handout that talks about, once you go through the all 10 sessions, where are you at and where do you want to go from there? And it does a beautiful job of tying into the labyrinth and the 4 quadrants, and giving lots of examples of things that congregations or communities might want to consider as a way to move this forward, so that this isn't just a one and done experience, and that people can look at, okay, now that we know things that maybe we didn't know before, how can we move this forward, and how can we continue to make a difference with dismantling racism in our communities. And so we were thinking that taking an excerpt from that Sacred Ground webinar and then taking some time in that last session to go through the handout together might be real helpful. So that's just kind of the format or the order of the sessions. And then just to give you an idea of what the facilitator guide will look like, is that we've taken each session, included an opening prayer for people to use. We have a land acknowledgement that the diocese has adopted to use for our area. Then whatever the video link is, discussion questions, which are still in process of being developed, and then a closing prayer. So that's kind of what each session will look like to help with the facilitators. And then the last document here that we wanted to share with everyone speaks to, again, the enormous amount of materials that are on the Episcopal Church website in the Sacred Ground curriculum. And so just felt that it would be helpful, and people might appreciate having links to some of the key points or key documents that would help anyone that is wanting to organize a dialogue circle, and the things that they would need to know to help them do that. So on the Episcopal Church website, for those of you that have maybe taken some time to go through and look at how that's set up, it can be somewhat confusing, because there's one section that's just for anyone that wants to learn more about Sacred Ground, and there's some introductory videos and some things. And then there's another section of the website that's password protected, that you need to get the password to get into the actual curriculum sessions and look at all the materials. And so again, like I said, just tried to put down the things that would be helpful for facilitators to access as they look at trying to set up a dialogue circle for their groups, and then just some of the handouts that are helpful to have easy access to. And then just a reminder that before starting a session, the facilitators need to go in to register their group, and then that's just the link that will take them to that spot on the website. So like I said, it's a work in progress, and this is kind of where we're at, and hoping that we'll finish getting this all together and ready to share with people in the diocese that would like to start their own Sacred Ground circles in the near future. Go back to, oops.
Thank you, Kathy. Coming in here for Rick. He has to step away just for a moment. He'll be back with us, but just to reiterate what Rick said at the beginning of our call, we are going to be sharing out these resources with everyone. So this is the purpose of this teach-in. You know, thank you, Kathy, for creating that resource. We're going to be now offering it. This is the beauty of what it means to be in relationship and to be together in this network and this Jesus movement. So with that, Margaret, do you want to share?
Yep. So this is sort of a riff on what Kathy was just talking about. And we hope that one of the things you're gaining from just seeing this stuff is to realize that this is both customizable, and the first group I did, the only group I facilitated, we went straight through just as it's sort of lined up in the materials. So so there's lots of options there. One of the things I realized was that this material is great if you're college educated and can read at that level. If you've done any of this work and read any of the stuff, it requires you know, a fairly high reading level, and that's just going to preclude people. So what I am working on, share screen, is an outline for this that focuses on the videos and the story and the sharing, and not on the readings. There are some, I mean, there's obviously really good stuff in the reading. You know, as far as I'm concerned, every person on the planet should read the Howard Thurman book, but not everybody's gonna. So, so what I've worked on, and again, we'll send this to you just so you can see, but is what I'll call a turnkey version. So anybody can take this and, you know, do the prep work and figure out how to, again, they can customize it as much as they want, but hopefully so that people don't feel like they have to have a background or a particular skill, but that they can just make this happen. So there's an introductory page, which is some of the stuff that we've already talked about, to remind people to think about who's going to lead, who's going to provide the Zoom link, what the role of the session leader is. And again, I tried to just use language in here that's not, you know, so I use session leader instead of facilitator because I think it's a little less intimidating. And that's what I was trying to do in here. I'm sure I missed that mark in lots of places, but, and so then I'm going to skip actually to, what am I going to skip to? I think I was going to skip to session 2. Sorry for the screen up and down. I know that's really annoying. So again, just to give an idea, that again, that we'll provide an opening scripture and a suggested prayer. Obviously, people can not use that or use something different. To provide prompts for the discussion. And again, you'll notice that my intent, at least here, was, as Allison and others were mentioning before, you know, to try to and to try to get it into people's stories, and how they connect with the material personally, and how they felt. So that's, as I think Amy said, you know, it's when we do the heart work, that heart, H-E-A-R-T work, is when transformation happens. So that's at least the sort of the intent. So discussion, in this case, I had them talk some and then watch the videos, the 2 short videos, and then some, you know, presentation material. So the facilitator can lead this, but to just pull some bullet points from the theme of the session and from the readings, and let people sort of think about that. And then as much as possible to have people do some kind of exercise if that fits. Some of you will be familiar with the invisible knapsack exercise that's part of seeing the face of God in each other. So in this case, I thought we might borrow that. And then just a reminder about closing, about announcements and reminders, when is the next section? What do you need to do beforehand? I set this up so that people, with the idea that people will watch the videos in the session. Because again, I think that's a helpful thing to do. The downside of that is that, at least in a couple of sessions, the videos are really long. And so it means the session would have to go longer than my intent of 90 minutes. But again, people could decide to do that differently. So this is what I've been working on. I've done, I think, 3 sessions. And I intend to continue to work on this so that we can offer to people to use as they want or don't want. I did have a short email conversation with Katrina Brown, who's sort of the matriarch of Sacred Ground, and she agreed that the idea of figuring out how to present this in different ways to different audiences was absolutely sort of in line with what they're trying to do. So, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Margaret. That's very helpful. In the chat, we've got a couple comments here. One was that this version that Margaret just went over might be helpful for middle school or high school age children, young people. And Allison also offers the anti-racism curriculum from the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta. Is really great material for those age groups. So I want to call your attention to that. It will also be in the harvest that Amy is going to put together. She'll make sure that we put information like that in there. And I have a question for Shelley. I see you asked a question. I think it was while Kathy was presenting. Is this your planning group or your Sacred Ground Circle? It's a question. I think it may have been directed to Kathy.
I listened to her for a little while and got it that it was a planning group that she was going through all of that stuff with. And I was like, oh, thank God. So
yeah. Yeah. The beauty in the program is that you can spend time with your planning group, really go over it. And like she mentioned, move things around as needed for your context.
Yeah, and Rick was a
So-
part of that group too, so he was there from the beginning.
Oh, yeah. So this is a great time now to open it up for questions,
Well,
comments.
Before you do that, Rick, I was just thinking that Adrian had another meeting and couldn't join us. And I just wanted to mention, because that'll be something that eventually will get shared out to everyone, is that one of the things that she's in the process of working on is going through each session and writing up a short synopsis of each of the videos and the different articles and other reading materials, so that then if people are looking at wanting to pick and choose the things that they think are going to be most helpful for them, because to do everything would just take too much time, that's a resource that she's going to be sharing out to people. And also, in our discussion, wanting to get any questions or feedback from those of you that are thinking about starting Sacred Ground Circles, as far as what other resources do you need, or what would be helpful, because part of our Province 5 Becoming Beloved Community group is working on putting together all of those materials in some type of a online resource place where people can access them for future reference. So if there's anything else that you need that we haven't talked about today, or that we can bring back to that group, let us know that too.
You know what? And I'll add to that, Kathy, if there's anything that you have that we should include in that, we're kind of imagining it to be a digital toolkit is kind of the language that we're using. So we know that we're stronger together. And why should we duplicate efforts? So I just wanted to add that on because I'm looking at a lot of folks with a lot of gifts and expertise and experience and ways to contribute here as I look at this screen. So I'm imagining that all of you have something to add to that toolkit.
And not just for Sacred Ground, but for any dismantling racism work that you're doing to share with others and network together. That was one of the goals of that digital tool. So.
Absolutely. That's the truth, Kathy and Amy. Any comments, questions, thoughts that folks have? Thanks, Shelley. It's not too often a Zoom call ends early, but we sure don't need to keep us here the whole time. Trust us.
My question for you is, my church tends to be in a very wealthy white neighborhood. We do have a couple of African-American folk who are on church leadership and also just parishioners. I don't want to ask, I'm not knowing how to even ask them if they're interested in being facilitators when it's work that I feel like we white folk really have to do on our own. I don't want it to feel like I'm asking them to teach us what we should be doing ourselves. Do you have any advice on how to approach this?
Shelley, I just have to say, I really appreciate that question. I feel like this is like the more we can just be honest, with these like wonderings, and I just appreciate it. So thank you for asking. I think that when we're in relationship with one another, just to simply say like, we're wondering about offering Sacred Ground. These are things I'm thinking about. And just to like enter the conversation with that kind of open-hearted wondering, I always find that when we can do that, it's going to be uncomfortable. And I think this is what we learn in this work is that it's all uncomfortable. And if we're not willing to be uncomfortable, then we're just going to stay where we are. And so I found that, and it's not to say that there has to be, I mean, in my mind, I think Allison, like, you kind of spoke to the different ways to offer it so it's not to say it has to look one way is the other thing. So just because there might not be people of color who step in, doesn't mean that it's not still an opportunity for us to do it, to try. And so that's what I would offer. And again, just thank you for asking the question.
I'd like to speak to that if I could. I think part of it, besides what you said, Amy, about being willing to be uncomfortable, is just being willing to talk to people and say, okay, this program, we know that this program was initially set up with the intention that it would be primarily aimed at white people. I mean, it says that on the Sacred Ground website. And so our groups have just talked to all the people of color who want to do it and kind of say, okay, we want to talk to you and see, are you, this is what it's going to be like. And unfortunately, we don't have a facilitator of color right now. And so what we've tried really hard to do is never just have one person of color in the room. And we have the same issue with anti-racism training because sometimes we have all white groups and sometimes we have groups that are racially mixed. And when it's an all white group, we have 2 white trainers because we don't, as one of our trainers of color said, I don't want people to get the impression that because they've heard me speak, one person of color, that now they know what people of color think. And so it's a tricky thing figuring it all out, but I think the willingness to just be honest with people and talk about the issues is the key thing.
I'd like to weigh in on that also. I believe that we should always look at a person of color the same way we look at a white person in terms of their ability in facilitating this program. And when I say what I'm looking for is people that have experience facilitating good big groups, people who have experience handling difficult subjects. That should be the criteria that you use in even inviting somebody to facilitate this kind of material, because it is very sensitive material and it takes a level of maturity and understanding of one's own educational and emotional state to deliver it. And just because a person happens to be of color doesn't mean that person really is capable of doing that in a productive way. So yeah, I think look at the qualifications, look at the, your experience with that person and their experiences in terms of doing that kind of work.
I was almost more concerned because she's a mom and her daughter is very, very active and they've been doing homeschooling and all this other stuff. I just thought she would be way too busy. And that made sense to me, but I also didn't want to not have any type of representation in facilitation if possible. So
yeah,
thank you for that. All of that is helpful.
The last thing I would add, though, is, I mean, as other people have said, until you talk to her, you don't know. But the other reality is that, and particularly if it ends up being an all-white group with all-white facilitators, is the value of the videos is that they bring other voices into the room. Granted, it's not the same as a real, it's not either online or on site. It's whatever the next version of that is. But nevertheless, you get the voices of people like Henry Louis Gates and others that do bring those voices into the room. Len, were you going to ask a question or?
Not yet.
Okay, we just heard some background noise, so.
There's motorcycles running outside our church right now.
Excellent.
Oh, great. Any other questions, comments that folks have before we wrap up this afternoon?
Just one comment, Rick, and that is, I think the Sacred Ground program is an incredible program. It's very rich with information and perspectives and methods of communicating for all of us. But it's just a dip in the pool of the historical context of race and racism. And if anything, we should all take away from it, it is a knowledge, a hunger and a thirst for more knowledge. We didn't talk about Tulsa at all in Sacred Ground, and yet that is an experience that has gripped the nation in recent weeks. And there's more than Tulsa out there. And there are more things that we can look at with regard to the indigenous experience. So it's just one tool, but it's a great tool to get you started. It's a foundational tool. So I would recommend it to anybody. And as you can see, I recommend to take it more than one time. You find something new every time you take it.
That's very, very true, Larry.
Rick,
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question about the Upper Peninsula representatives here. Have you been able to include the Native American population in the Upper Peninsula, for instance, at Bay Mills or someplace else there?
I'm going to ask Kathy to answer that. She's been working with our 5 tribal communities in the Upper Peninsula. And she's nodding her head like she's glad to answer.
Yes, that is has been a work in progress, and what we have been learning is that, you know, building trust and building relationships takes time. And so one of the projects that we're continuing to work on, that is the result of a United Think offering grant that we received, oh man, I think it's been 4 or 5 years now, is creating a mobile exhibit to tell the truth about the real history of the Anishinaabe people throughout the Upper Peninsula, including the harm that was done by the church, with a formal apology from our bishop as a part of that exhibit. And so we are working with some amazing Indigenous people. There's a man from Keweenaw Bay Indian community who is our videographer, and then another woman from the Marquette area who's also a language teacher and connected with the Native American Studies program at Northern Michigan University. And they have just started the process of interviewing boarding school survivors for our exhibit and putting that together. They also have another Indigenous singer, songwriter, musician who is going to be providing music. We're hoping for some of the times that the exhibit is going to be on display around the UP at various locations. So it's still coming together, but yes, that's, you know, and each congregation is kind of doing their own thing. I can just speak to Trinity and Gladstone. They received a small grant last year to build a labyrinth on the church grounds for a place for people to go for meditation and prayer. And they also wanted to include a peace pole as a part of the labyrinth. And the really cool thing about that is that one of the languages they made sure to include on the peace pole was the Ojibwa language of "May peace prevail in the world." And so then, as a way to try to build some bridges and form some relationships with the Hannahville Indian community, which is the closest one to Gladstone, we have been in a series of planning sessions with them for a ground blessing and dedication of the peace pole. They invited us to their culture center to share a meal together and listen to some teachings from their elders. And they asked us to bring the peace pole and put it next to their Eagle staff during the time we were together, which was just amazing. I get all emotional, but anyway, so there are some inroads that are being made. And I remember the one elder in particular having conversations with him like probably 2 years ago. And as soon as we said, you know, and this was like from our role as the Peace Center, but as soon as we said we were working with the Episcopal Diocese, it was like, oh, don't talk to us about church, you know. So it takes a while to work through some of that. And understandably so. I mean, there are a lot of things, a lot of harm that's been done by the church, and so so yes, that was kind of a long way to answer your question, but we're also, oh, the other thing I should mention is that with the most recent grant that we're working on with the Becoming Beloved Community Grant, one of the things that we wrote into the grant is to provide a stipend for having a resident elder knowledge keeper from one of the 5 tribal nations in the UP to serve as a consultant and on the diocesan leadership team to make sure that perspective is being considered and included, and that, you know, in our workings with the social justice issues that we're involved in, that we're being respectful and, you know, following traditions and things like that. So that's still a piece that, you know, COVID kind of put a kibosh on, because those are conversations that really need to be happening on site, in person, and not over the phone or a Zoom call. And so now that things are finally starting to open up again, we're hoping to have some times where we can be visiting the different culture directors in each of the tribes and talking more about what we'd like to work with them together on. So yes,
Thank you,
hopefully.
Kathy, that's very helpful. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I apologize. As you can tell, it's something I'm pretty passionate about.
That's good.
So,
Any other questions or comments before we move into our closing reading?
One thing I'll just say, and I know this came up in our circle as we've been, so let me back up and say this offering came from, you've heard us kind of name this Province 5 Becoming Beloved Community Circle. So there are some of us that have been working together for a while. And one of the things that became clear in our working together is that we were all kind of playing around with engaging sacred ground differently and wanting to be in conversation with one another around what we were learning and what we were struggling with. And so we're offering this up kind of in that spirit. But I know one of the things that early on that had come up for us was, Larry, you spoke to it, so I just wanted to lift it up again, is that there really is an opportunity as groups finish and complete sacred ground to be in the question of what next. And so, and for us, it kind of invited some conversation for us around, like, what does that look like practically? How do you make space for that, you know, in this series? And so just wanting to say that again, we don't want to lose the opportunity in that group after you've really created some sense of community and trust, to not be in that question together, because it can be an important question to be in. So I just wanted to lift that up, like I said, before we close.
Thanks, Amy. Anyone else?
I'd like
Okay.
to just say thank you to all of you. You gave me some really wonderful information that I am now going to have to go and read and watch and create and that type of thing. But it's really lovely. And the cool thing about ours too right now is that because we are in a very small town, we are working with 4 other churches, 1 Methodist, 1 Lutheran, 2 Episcopalian, and then our one of our synagogues as well. And so I'm not going to be the only one, thank God. But this information is going to be really helpful when I get our planning group going. So thank you.
Great. We're glad to help. Okay, Margaret, I think it's time for the reading.
Okay, so this is a reading from the introduction of Stephanie Speller's book, The Church Cracked Open. And you know what, it says the host has spotlighted me. Isn't that exciting? Okay, so this is, again, it's from the introduction, and it's a section called The Woman Who Broke the Alabaster Jar. And this is, again, Stephanie Speller's voice. This story shows up in all 4 Gospels, but God kept drawing me to Mark's simple, action-packed account. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. That's from Mark 14. She continues, like most commentators and preachers, I thought I knew the story. Here was a woman who loved Jesus and sacrificed something precious in order to witness to that love. The disciples stormed and complained at her for wasting the oil and at Jesus for allowing her to approach in the first place. I've always been fond of Jesus in this story. Not only did he refuse to shun her, he got sassy with them and suggested they should be more like her. Wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Can you imagine the scandal as she walks into a dinner gathering of men hosted by a Pharisee? This woman carries a precious alabaster tiled jar of perfumed oil worth a year's wages. She is the essence of disruption, hijacking their senses of sight, smell, taste, and decency. Does she offer the jar to the host or to Jesus? Maybe pour some nard into her hand and anoint Jesus? No, she breaks the alabaster jar. In a culture where women are seen but not heard and have so little public agency, she walks in unannounced and uninvited and breaks a jar. The crack and crash must have felt like lightning and thunder. That's okay. She has every intention of profoundly disrupting and decentering the proceedings. So she takes something precious and breaks it. Stephanie continues, in my prayer, I hear her speaking these wise words, calming the storm even as she stirs the waters. You and your church, you are holding a beautiful jar. You are used to grasping it with both hands, tilting and pouring the contents with moderation through the carefully crafted spout. Someday, you will have to break it open so the contents flow free, or God will do it for you. You and your church, you think loving a thing means protecting and maintaining it exactly as it was handed to you. Someday you will understand what it means to love something enough to let it crack apart and just sit with the pieces. Notice what needs to be removed for good, and then faithfully piece together what matters most to make something more whole, something more like what God intended all along. Someday you will lose your life and gain real life. This could be one of those times.
Thank you, Margaret.
Welcome.
And thank you, friends, for joining us today. And as I mentioned, you'll be receiving an email from Amy and plenty of ways to get in touch with us and to continue this network together. So unless anyone has a parting comment, we are done for the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace, everybody.